Kareem.
And since we're addressing the topic of post-colonialism in Egypt, we of course had to address Nasser.
Like, I guess the best way of putting it is that Nasser is like the omnipresent phenomena that never dies, basically. When it comes to Nasser and the building of this new state, like, I think it would be fair to say that this was like transitional, and it was a radical transition as well. Like, because the way he perceived, like the way that his regime perceived certain plans about moving forward, about implementing change, were completely radical in comparison to to the sort of plans that were being propagated before his rise to power.
So I think first, to make sense of why Nasser becomes this towering figure in 20th century history in Egypt, is to see what was happening before him, what actually made the industrialization program that kind of refined Nasser's vision for Egypt meant. The Egyptian state in the early 20th century was suffering from a state of malaise, you could say. The state that was largely kind of constructed during the Ismailite period in the 19th century as a response to the debt crisis was to a large extent an extractive state, very much focused on extracting the value that's needed to service the debts, and with very little vision of what could be done. There's a lot of proposals that are being floated, radical proposals about land reform, about electrifying the Low Aswan Dam to provide electricity for Egypt. So many proposals, but nothing really is being implemented. Even World Bank reports from that period reflect that. They speak of Egypt as virtually having no developmental vision. So, in a large sense, what actually differentiates Nasser from the period before him is that Nasser kind of becomes the first one in almost two generations to actually try to see what an Egyptian state could do, to actually try to build that state and see how it could transform Egypt. Nasser, much like a lot of Egyptians at that time, realized that if Egypt is to become an independent country, a sovereign country, a master of its own fate that's not occupied by the British, that means that the Egyptian economy itself has to change. That Egypt has to move from being just an exporter of raw material, just living off what you can call of commodity exports largely, to an industrial economy that's capable of generating the development and the industrial power that a modern state would need to assert its sovereignty and its legitimacy internally, provide the public goods that become a hallmark of the modern state as it shifts into more of welfare capitalism in that historical period. As such, the industrialization program kind of becomes the spine of that new state. All its policies roughly become developed as auxiliaries of that goal. Nasser's attempt to kind of create that alliance with the national bourgeoisie fails and falters very quickly. He pretty quickly realizes that they are not going to be on board for the kind of investment. They are incapable and probably not really incentivized to carry out that project. As such, the state actually alters its outlook completely on the industrialization process, decides that nationalizations are going to happen, the economic organization is going to be established, the state is going to manage directly industrial production at a greater capacity, it's going to intervene more in the economy, to carry out that project of industrialization. As such, most policies formulated during that time, whether economic, policies, be them financial or agricultural or industrial, they are kind of built around making that transformation in the Egyptian mode of production, if you will. That, of course, state building it's not just institution building, it's not actually just constructing physical spaces in factories and homes. It's also an ideological project fundamentally.
Definitely.
When the industrialization process and plans start, they are indeed incredibly ambitious plans. You're talking about virtually more than doubling the Egyptian industrial capacity. That's a massive undertaking. So the first industrial plan for Egypt, the plan sought to both expand the heavy industry sector, the consumer goods sector, and the armament sector, all at the same time. A country that had a marginal industrial sector up until 5 years before that.
As we said in the paper, we went back to this sort of intellectual journal that was issued in Egypt under the name Tali'a, or the Vanguard in English, and it was basically a group of Marxists who, to a large extent, worked with Nasser, or at least supported his vision. They were intellectuals, scholars, and activists as well. And we felt that there was this consensus that, as much as they supported this program and as much as they supported the plan, they identified one main point which needs to which we need to reflect on, which is the emphasis within the plan on the consumers industries vis-a-vis the heavy industries, because the first 5-year plan focused on on this non-heavy industries, and these scholars or intellectuals said that if we are actually want to move beyond where we are, and we actually want to see the end results, we should start shifting our emphasis or our focus on more towards investing in heavy industries. And we felt that this Nasser didn't actually manage to do, not only because of the defeat that he had to deal with in 1967, but there were also a group of other factors within the system itself that prevented this sort of transformation. There were a lot of problems with bureaucracy. There were a lot of problems with plans or visions that were basically pushed aside. As part of our attempt to deconstruct this general context in which this experiment was born, we tried to look at what we considered misconceptions surrounding the experiment itself. This includes the categorization or the labeling of the experiment as a socialist experiment that depended on socialist planning or central planning. In our understanding, this was not the case at all. On the contrary, the Nasserite regime certainly borrowed certain elements from the socialist way of thinking, but it did not actually develop a fully socialist or central planning. A proper way of describing what Nasser did is developmental planning and not central planning. The regime did not actually outlaw the private sector. It did not prevent the private sector from actually working within the national economy.
Actually, within the industrial sector specifically, we see that while the large industrial establishment in Egypt were almost completely dominated by state enterprises, almost 90% of them, for the entire industrial economy, state control only manifested in around 60%. So there was a significantly large and vibrant private sector, but mostly it was restricted to the small and medium establishments that mainly worked to supply the large industrial establishments that the regime establishes, employing tens of thousands of workers in heavy industry or consumer goods.
Another important aspect about the Nasserite experience is the way it dealt with with the working women, like how the regime sought to integrate them into its industrialization program against the patriarchal norms that existed back then in Egypt. Interestingly, we don't think that the regime actually fought patriarchy as much as it thought to integrate these women without antagonizing those who thought that those who thought or saw that women should not actually work. So the regime actually pushed like this idea of having working women present in a number of factories all over the country. Yet it did so within very specific limits that did not antagonize those with patriarchal views.
Actually, some of the limits established during that period where women were formally given the right to work, fully given that right. Some of these restrictions, such as women not working specifically in certain entertainment places or working at night shifts, some of these actually still continue up until now. They have not been changed. This is the gains of women in the working place has largely stagnated since then.
It fell short from introducing full emancipation or giving women workers the right to be or in equal terms with their male counterparts, because these norms persisted.
That national anti-colonial experiment meant that the experiment was always felt really under siege, and that could easily be justified. Egypt was invaded more than once by different countries, often for incredibly flimsy reasons. And that kind of meant that the industrialization project itself had to be shaped around these, around the imperial reaction to the anti-colonial movement that's taking hold in Egypt. And that meant that questions over how the industrialization program itself is directed, whether it should focus on the heavy industry that Egypt needs on the long term to sustain the project itself, to sustain itself independent of centers of imperial power in Europe and in the US, or should it focus on the consumer goods that were necessary to improve the quality of life for the average Egyptian, allowed for the state to accrue the capital that it needs to actually finance the heavy industries project, meant that the state had a very difficult situation and faced very real external limitations on the industrialization program that it was trying to implement. Eventually, the state largely tried to pursue both at the same time. At the end, consumer goods with more success because these are easier than capital goods to manufacture in passable or quality for consumption. Nasser does not succeed in democratizing political control over that new state. He certainly attempts things like establishing the Youth League of the Arab Socialist Union, the magazine itself, Al-Tali'a. There is that realization that social and political cadres need to be built up to protect the system in the future. However, the system does not succeed in that, mainly, I would say, because the experiment was far too short. And that, on the other hand, the system itself was not built to have that higher level of democratic input, which means that when policies regarding industrialization and the social gains that accompanied it, such as the doubling of the minimum wage, or macroeconomic gains such as improved industrial output, the growth of value added per worker, something more than 70% during that period.
Yeah, and I think a good example here is that how the regime dealt with the labor unions, even though the regime worked very hard on establishing these sort of institutions where like workers can express their opinion or like ask for improvements and so on. It at the same time it actually co-opted these institutions since the beginning. So like the workers theoretically had this sort of space, but it was completely co-opted and observed and surveilled, like it was working within the larger regime's like strategy. So it was not a space for actually organizing as much as it was a space for support.
Yeah, I think broadly the thesis of the paper is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of yes, some parts of that experiment were absolute failures. Some parts of that experiment were abhorrent, but also some parts of that experience deserve to be recovered and deserve to be understood better.
Exactly.